The jazz quartet's melody floated through the air like silk. But beneath the marble floors of Steve Williams' penthouse, a different sound fought to break through. The labored breathing of a pregnant woman trapped inside a steel dog cage. Nyla's trembling hands gripped the cold bars as another contraction seized her body, whispering her husband's name through gritted teeth, praying he might somehow remember she existed. But Steve was upstairs, his champagne glass raised high, his laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings, completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in his own basement. And as he moved through the gala like a king surveying his kingdom, his smile brilliant and his confidence unshakable, he hid a cruelty far darker than any of those well-dressed investors could have imagined. Tonight, his secret was supposed to stay buried in the soundproofed room below. But technology and truth had other plans. Dear viewers, this is the story of a woman who was kicked while she was down, both figuratively and literally, only to discover that the man who claimed to be her protector was the biggest threat to her future. It is a story of how a single act of cruelty, intended to crush a woman's spirit and hide her away in a cage, became the very spark that burned down a billionaire's empire and ignited a flame of justice that could not be extinguished. Hello family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten. Voices like Nyla's, and stories that remind us that no cage is strong enough to hold a resilient soul. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because together, we are not just telling stories. We are keeping hope alive. Now let's begin. Steve Williams had always believed he was destined for something extraordinary, something far beyond the middle-class life his parents had settled for. Even before he married Nyla, he imagined himself at the pinnacle of Atlanta's black elite, closing billion-dollar deals, gracing the covers of business magazines, commanding respect from the same people who once looked down on him. And tonight's gala, the most ambitious he had ever hosted, was supposed to be the night his arrival at the top became undeniable. He had spent months orchestrating every detail. The vintage Dom Perignon flowing like water, the celebrity chef flown in from New York, the carefully curated guest list filled with venture capitalists, tech moguls, and the senior partners who would decide his future. Everything had to be flawless, every moment perfectly executed, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could be allowed to threaten it. But then there was Nyla, beautiful, graceful Nyla with her natural warmth, her genuine laugh, and her very pregnant body. A woman whose condition alone felt like a crack in Steve's carefully constructed armor. Nyla had been a non-profit director, respected in her community, beloved by the people she served. She was authentic in a way that came effortlessly, never performing or calculating her next move. She wore her heart openly, always spoke with genuine compassion, always smiled with a warmth that drew people to her naturally, a warmth Steve had come to resent because people loved Nyla for who she was, not for what she could do for them. Even Steve's colleagues admired her deeply, often asking about her with genuine interest, sometimes more interest than they showed in Steve himself. And though Nyla never meant to outshine anyone, Steve always felt diminished when she spoke too freely, laughed too loudly, or showed too much emotion. For months, that resentment had simmered quietly beneath Steve's polished exterior. It grew from small moments, dinner parties where she shared stories about her non-profit work instead of letting him dominate the conversation. Gatherings where she'd gently correct his exaggerations. Times when her authenticity made his performance look hollow by comparison. Nyla's the real deal, one investor had said at a previous event. You're lucky to have someone so grounded. Another commented after she'd discussed income inequality with passion. They were compliments, spoken with admiration. But to Steve, they were threats. As the pregnancy progressed, those threats multiplied. Steve began to notice things he'd overlooked before. How Nyla's emotional honesty made his calculated charm seem fake. How her growing need for support exposed his inability to be vulnerable. How her pregnancy symptoms, the fatigue, the dizziness, the mood swings, were becoming impossible to hide or control. And worst of all, Nyla refused to see what Steve saw. That her very humanity, in all its messy, unpredictable glory, was a liability to everything he'd worked to build. Steve Williams stood in front of the full-length mirror in his dressing room, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. The silk Tom Ford tuxedo fit perfectly, tailored to accentuate his athletic build, but something still felt off. He tilted his head, examining his reflection with the same scrutiny he applied to quarterly earnings reports. The lighting was wrong, too harsh. He made a mental note to have the crew adjust the overhead fixtures in the foyer before guests arrived. First impressions were everything, and tonight, everything had to be absolutely perfect. "Nyla," he called out, his voice sharp enough to cut through the walls. "Where are you? We need to go over the timeline again." From the bedroom next door, he heard a soft groan followed by footsteps. Nyla appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other cradling her rounded belly. She wore a silk robe, her natural hair pulled back in a loose bun, her face bare of makeup. At 6 months pregnant, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone perpetually aware of their center of gravity. "Steve, I've been over the timeline 4 times already," she said, exhaustion evident in her voice. "I know when to greet people, when to transition to the dining room, when to—" "Then why aren't you dressed?" Steve interrupted, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "The caterers arrive in 45 minutes. The florist is already downstairs. And you're standing there looking like you just woke up from a nap." Nyla's jaw tightened. "Because I did just wake up from a nap. The doctor said I need to rest more. My blood pressure has been—" "I don't want to hear about your blood pressure tonight," Steve said, turning away from the mirror to face her fully. His eyes swept over her with the same assessing gaze he'd use on a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "I need you to understand something. Marcus Chun from Titan Ventures is coming tonight. So is Diane Richardson from the Times. This isn't just a party, Nyla. This is the night that determines whether I become a footnote or a legacy." He crossed the room to her, and for a moment his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He reached out and touched her shoulder, but the gesture felt rehearsed, like he was following a script titled, "How to be a Caring Husband." "I know you're tired," he continued, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a gentle tone. "I know the pregnancy hasn't been easy, but I need you with me tonight. The version of you that people love. Charming, graceful. Not—" he paused, choosing his words carefully, struggling. Nyla pulled away from his touch. "I'm 6 months pregnant, Steve. I'm not struggling. I'm pregnant. There's a difference." "Don't do this," Steve said, his voice hardening again. "Don't make this difficult. You know how important tonight is. We've been planning this for months. I've spent $70,000 on this event. $70,000. And you're going to stand there and tell me you're too tired to play your part. My part? Nyla's voice rose slightly. Is that what I am to you? A role in your production? Steve's fingers drummed against his thigh, a tell he hadn't quite mastered hiding when his patience wore thin. You're twisting my words. All I'm asking is that you be the woman I married. The woman who could work a room better than anyone I knew. Remember the Bennett Foundation gala? You had those investors eating out of your hand. That's the woman I need tonight. That woman wasn't 6 months pregnant and dealing with constant back pain, Nyla said quietly. But Steve was already moving, pacing the length of the dressing room like a caged animal. The Johnsons will be here, he said, more to himself than to her. So will the Okonkwo's. They all need to see us as the couple of the future. Young, black, successful, unstoppable. A power couple. Not, he gestured vaguely in her direction, whatever this energy is you're giving off right now. Nyla stared at him, something shifting behind her eyes. What energy, Steve? Exhaustion? Humanity? Drama, Steve said flatly. You're being dramatic, and I can't have drama tonight. I need you composed. I need you radiant. I need you to make people believe that we have it all together. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. Can you do that for me? Can you just give me one night where you don't fall apart? The words hung in the air between them like poison. Nyla's hand instinctively moved to her belly, a protective gesture that Steve noted with irritation. I'm not falling apart, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm growing our child. Then act like a woman who's happy about it, Steve snapped. Not like some fragile victim who can barely stand up straight. The dress I had commissioned for you cost $8,000. It's designed specifically to make your pregnancy look elegant, not debilitating. So put it on, do your makeup, and remember who you're supposed to be tonight. He walked past her toward the door, pausing only to add, and Nyla, please don't embarrass me. I've worked too hard to let anything ruin this. Anything. The threat in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. As he disappeared down the hallway to supervise the final preparations, Nyla stood alone in the dressing room, staring at the emerald green gown hanging on the closet door. It was beautiful, she had to admit. Custom-made, flowing, designed to showcase rather than hide her pregnant form. But as she looked at it, all she could think about was how heavy it would feel after 3 hours of standing, how the heels that matched it would make her ankles swell, how the smile Steve expected her to wear would ache across her face like a mask she could never remove. From downstairs, she heard Steve's voice, commanding and confident as he directed the staff. She heard him laugh at something someone said, that practiced, charming laugh he'd perfected over years of networking. And she realized with startling clarity that she barely recognized the man she'd married anymore. Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, she was only now seeing who he'd been all along. The penthouse glittered like something out of a magazine spread. Champagne flutes caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, casting tiny rainbows across the faces of Atlanta's elite. The jazz quartet played something smooth and sophisticated in the corner, their music weaving through conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard. Nyla stood near the marble bar, the emerald gown hugging her frame exactly as Steve had promised it would. Elegant, expensive, and exhausting. She'd been on her feet for 40 minutes, and already her lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. But she smiled through it, nodding as Mrs. Richardson from the Times asked about her due date and nursery plans. Nyla had perfected the art of pleasant conversation years ago, back when she genuinely enjoyed these gatherings, back when Steve's hand on her lower back felt like support rather than a leash. "We're thinking soft greys and whites," Nyla said, reciting the answer Steve had coached her to give. "Gender-neutral, modern, but warm." "How lovely," Mrs. Richardson replied, though her attention had already drifted toward Marcus Chun, who was holding court near the windows with several venture capitalists. "Your husband certainly knows how to throw an event. This is quite impressive." Nyla followed her gaze to find Steve across the room, animated and confident, his laugh carrying over the music. He was in his element, moving from group to group like a politician working a campaign rally. Every handshake was firm, every smile calculated, every word chosen for maximum impact. She watched him place his hand on Marcus Chen's shoulder, leaning in as if sharing a confidence, and saw Chen nod appreciatively. Steve caught her eye from across the room, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She knew that look. It was the same one he gave her during their wedding, when she'd stumbled slightly coming down the aisle. Not concern. Assessment. She straightened her posture, lifted her champagne flute, filled with sparkling water, and offered him a reassuring smile. But the room had started to tilt. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in her equilibrium that Nyla tried to ignore. She'd been having these spells for weeks. The doctor had called them normal pregnancy vertigo. Nothing to worry about as long as she sat down when they happened. But sitting down wasn't an option right now. Not with Steve watching. Not with 60 of Atlanta's most influential people filling their home. "Excuse me," Nyla murmured to Mrs. Richardson, who had already turned away. She took a step toward the hallway, thinking she could slip into the powder room, sit for just a moment, let the dizziness pass. But her heel caught on the edge of the Persian rug. The world lurched sideways. Nyla's hand shot out instinctively, grasping for something, anything to steady herself. Her fingers found the edge of the bar, but not before her other hand knocked into a tray of champagne flutes a server was carrying past. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the jazz quartet like a gunshot. The music stopped. Conversations halted mid-sentence. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward Nyla as champagne spread across the marble floor in a golden puddle, glass glittering like diamonds in the growing silence. "Oh God," Nyla whispered, her hand moving to her belly as the vertigo intensified. "I'm so sorry, I—" The server, a young black woman who couldn't have been more than 20, immediately crouched down. "It's okay, ma'am. Don't worry about it. Are you all right?" But Nyla wasn't looking at the server. She was looking at Marcus Chun, who stood 3 feet away, his custom Italian suit now splattered with champagne, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and disgust. And beyond him, cutting through the crowd like a shark through water, came Steve. "Marcus, I am so incredibly sorry," Steve said, his voice tight with controlled fury beneath the veneer of concern. He reached Chin first, pulling out his pocket square to dab uselessly at the man's jacket. "Please, let me get you a fresh drink, a new shirt, anything you need." "I'm fine, Steve," Chin said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "These things happen." "Nyla," Steve said, finally turning to her, his hand gripping her elbow hard enough to bruise. "Are you hurt?" The question sounded like concern to everyone else. But Nyla heard the accusation beneath it, the barely restrained rage in the way his fingers dug into her arm. "I just got dizzy," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to. Why don't we get you somewhere you can sit down? Steve interrupted, already guiding her away from the crowd. To the guests, he called out with an apologetic smile. Pregnancy vertigo. The doctor warned us about this. Please, everyone, continue enjoying yourselves. We'll have this cleaned up in just a moment. The quartet resumed playing. Conversations tentatively restarted. But Nyla could feel the stares following them as Steve steered her toward the hallway, his grip on her arm unrelenting. "Steve, you're hurting me," she whispered. He didn't loosen his hold. Instead, he leaned close to her ear as they passed through the archway, his voice low and venomous. "What the hell was that? I told you I got dizzy. It just happened. I couldn't." "You couldn't control yourself for one night?" Steve hissed. "One night, Nyla. That's all I asked. Marcus Chun is the most important person in this room. Do you have any idea how much money he represents? And you just humiliated me in front of him." "It was an accident," Nyla said, her own anger finally rising through the vertigo. "I'm pregnant, Steve. Sometimes pregnant women get dizzy. It's not deliberate sabotage." Steve stopped walking, spinning her to face him in the empty corridor. His eyes were cold, calculating, and something else she'd never seen before. Something that made her stomach clench with fear. "Wasn't it?" he said softly. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you made a scene the moment I wasn't paying attention to you. Like you needed to remind everyone that you're the victim here. Poor, pregnant Nyla, suffering so much." "That's not. You can't actually believe that." "I believe you've been fighting me all night," Steve said. "Complaining about being tired, dragging your feet getting dressed, and now this performance in front of my investors. You know what I think? I think you're trying to punish me for something. For asking you to be professional. For expecting you to honor the commitment you made to this marriage, to this life we built." Nyla stared at him, searching his face for any trace of the man she'd fallen in love with. But there was nothing there except cold calculation and a rage so profound it seemed to reshape his features into something unrecognizable. "You need to go lie down," Steve said, his tone shifting to something falsely gentle. "You're clearly not well. Not yourself. Let me help you downstairs to the guest room where you can rest." "I don't want to go downstairs," Nyla said, instinct suddenly screaming at her to stay in public view, to stay where people could see them. "I'll just sit in the bedroom for a few minutes, and then—" "The bedroom is too close to the party," Steve interrupted. "You'll hear everything, and it will stress you out. The guest room is quieter. Better for you and the baby." His hand moved to her back, pressing, guiding, insistent. "Come on. Let me take care of you." And as he led her toward the elevator that would take them down to the lower level, Nyla realized with growing horror that his concern wasn't for her well-being. It was for his image. She'd become a problem to be solved, a glitch in his perfect evening that needed to be removed from view. She just didn't know yet how permanent that removal would be. The elevator descended with a soft mechanical hum, the kind of smooth, expensive sound that whispered wealth. Nyla leaned against the mirrored wall, her reflection fractured into a dozen tired versions of herself. Steve stood beside her, his hand still on her back, no longer guiding, but holding her in place. "I really don't need to lie down," Nyla said, trying once more. "If I could just sit in the study for a few minutes." "The study shares a wall with the living room," Steve said, his voice flat. "You'll hear everything. The music, the laughter. It'll just agitate you more." The elevator doors opened to reveal the basement level, dimly lit and silent. "Trust me, this is better." The basement was Steve's domain, a space he'd insisted on designing himself when they bought the penthouse. It was supposed to be a game room eventually, complete with a pool table and a home theater, but they'd never gotten around to finishing it. Now it was mostly storage, boxes of old files, gym equipment Steve never used, and in the far corner, behind a soundproofed door he'd installed for a music studio that never materialized, the kennel room. They'd gotten a dog 2 years ago, a German shepherd named Apollo that Steve wanted as a status symbol. But Apollo required attention, training, walks, things Steve didn't have time for and refused to let Nyla handle once she became pregnant. So the dog went to Steve's mother upstate, and the custom-built kennel room sat empty, its steel cage and concrete floor waiting for a pet that would never return. Nyla had forgotten about it entirely until Steve opened that soundproofed door. "Why are we going in here?" she asked, stopping at the threshold. The room was cold, temperature-controlled for an animal that no longer existed. Fluorescent lights flickered on automatically, illuminating the steel cage that dominated the space. It was enormous, designed for a large dog, with bars thick enough to contain something powerful. "Your medicine," Steve said simply. "Remember? I told you I'd moved some of your prenatal vitamins and the prescription for your blood pressure down here. I was reorganizing the bathroom cabinets last week." It was plausible enough. Steve was always reorganizing, always optimizing space. But something about the way he said it, the way he positioned himself between her and the door, made Nyla's instincts scream. "I don't need them right now," she said, backing up slightly. "I can take them later." "Nyla." Steve's voice took on that patient tone he used when explaining something to someone he considered stupid. "Your blood pressure has been a concern. The doctor specifically said you need to stay consistent with the medication. You just had a dizzy spell that embarrassed both of us in front of the most important people in my career. So yes, you need them right now." He walked further into the room, opening a cabinet mounted on the wall. Sure enough, there were several orange pill bottles lined up neatly inside. He shook one, the rattle of pills confirming their presence, then turned back to her with an expression that might have been concern if his eyes weren't so cold. "Come here," he said. "Take them, and then you can rest on the cushions." He gestured to the corner where Apollo's dog beds were still stacked. "I know it's not ideal, but it's quiet. Soundproof, actually. You won't hear a thing from upstairs. You can truly rest." Nyla's feet felt rooted to the floor. Every instinct told her not to enter that room, but she couldn't articulate why. What was she afraid of? This was her husband. This was their home. He was offering her medicine and a place to rest. But the cage loomed in her peripheral vision like a prophecy. "Steve, I want to go back upstairs," she said quietly. Something flickered across his face, frustration, rage, calculation. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened into something sharp and brittle. "You want to go back upstairs? After what you just did? After you threw champagne all over Marcus Chun and made me look like I can't even manage my own household?" He took a step toward her. "You don't get to humiliate me and then dictate terms, Nyla. That's not how this works. I didn't humiliate you. I got dizzy. I'm pregnant, Steve. I'm carrying your child, and you're acting like I committed some crime by having a medical episode." "A medical episode?" Steve laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what we're calling your little performance? Because from where I stood, it looked like sabotage. It looked like you couldn't stand that I was succeeding, that I was finally getting everything I've worked for. So you had to make it about you. That's insane, Nyla said, her voice rising. You're being paranoid and cruel, and I'm going back upstairs. She turned toward the door, but Steve moved faster. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist, spinning her back around with enough force that she stumbled. Before she could regain her balance, he was pushing her deeper into the room, his other hand on her shoulder, his body blocking her exit. Steve, stop! Nyla's voice cracked with fear now, all pretense of calm gone. What are you doing? Protecting my career, Steve said, his voice eerily calm. Protecting everything I've built. Everything we've built together, even if you can't see that right now. He maneuvered her toward the cage, and suddenly Nyla understood. The horror of it crashed over her like ice water, stealing her breath. No, she whispered. Steve, no. You can't, you wouldn't. Just for a few hours, Steve said, and the reasonableness in his tone was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. Just until the investors leave. Until Marcus signs the papers. Then I'll come get you, and we'll talk about this rationally. But right now, I can't have you up there. I can't risk you doing something else, saying something else. You're not stable, Nyla. You're emotional and unpredictable, and I can't let you destroy this for me. I'm your wife. Nyla screamed, struggling against his grip. But 6 months pregnant and dizzy, she was no match for his strength. I'm carrying your baby, and I'll take excellent care of both of you, Steve said, opening the cage door. The hinges creaked, a sound that would haunt Nyla's nightmares forever. Once you've calmed down, once you've learned that there are consequences for your actions. He pushed her inside with one final shove. Nyla fell to her knees on the concrete floor, her hands instinctively wrapping around her belly to protect the baby. She turned, scrambling back toward the door, but Steve had already swung it shut. The lock clicked with a finality that echoed off the soundproof walls. Steve, please, Nyla begged, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel bars. Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the champagne. I'm sorry about everything. Just let me out. Steve stood on the other side of the bars, straightening his bow tie, smoothing his jacket. When he looked at her, his expression was almost pitying. This is for your own good, he said softly. And mine. You'll understand eventually. Once you've had time to think about what you did, about what's really important. What's important? Nyla's voice broke on a sob. Our baby is important. Our marriage is important. Not some business deal, not some. Everything is important. Steve shouted suddenly, his composure cracking. My career, my reputation, my standing in this community, it's all important. And you were going to ruin it because you couldn't keep yourself together for one night. He took a breath, regaining control. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, almost gentle. I'll be back in 3 hours. Maybe 4. The contracts should be signed by then. I'll bring you water, food, whatever you need. And then we'll talk about how we move forward from this. He turned toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Nyla? Don't bother screaming. That's the beauty of soundproofing. No one will hear you. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The lock engaged, and Nyla was alone in the cold room, her hands gripping the bars of a dog cage, her pregnant body curled on concrete, while above her, the jazz quartet played on and champagne continued to flow. The party was just getting started. Steve stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb. B. 1, 2. The mirrored walls reflected a man in perfect control. Bow tie straight, jacket unwrinkled, expression composed. He took 3 deep breaths, a technique he'd learned from a corporate leadership seminar. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Reset. Refocus. Perform. By the time the doors opened to the main floor, Steve Williams wore his smile like armor. The party had continued without him, which was both relieving and slightly irritating. The quartet had transitioned into something more upbeat, and clusters of guests mingled throughout the living room and out onto the terrace, where heat lamps kept the January chill at bay. Steve spotted Marcus Chun near the windows, now wearing a fresh shirt, one of Steve's own white Brioni dress shirts that he'd sent his assistant to retrieve from the bedroom. Small gesture, big impact. That's how you recovered from a crisis. Steve, James Okonkwo called out, waving him over to a group discussing cryptocurrency. There you are. How's Nyla doing? Steve glided over, accepting a fresh champagne flute from a passing server. She's resting comfortably. Pregnancy vertigo, you know how it is. The doctor warned us it might happen, but of course it chooses tonight of all nights. He laughed, self-deprecating and charming. She was mortified about the champagne incident, especially with Marcus. Is he all right? He's fine, James assured him. Already joking about it, actually. Said it's the most exciting thing that's happened at a tech event in months. That's gracious of him, Steve said, making a mental note to follow up with Chun personally before the night ended. He scanned the room, cataloging faces, assessing moods. Everyone seemed relaxed, engaged. Nyla's stumble, he corrected himself, hadn't derailed anything. If anything, it had given people something to talk about, a moment of human imperfection that made the evening feel less rehearsed. He could work with that. Steve, this space is incredible. Diane Richardson appeared at his elbow, her journalist's eyes taking in every detail. How long have you been in this penthouse? Just over 2 years, Steve said smoothly. We fell in love with the views, but honestly, it's Nyla's touch that made it a home. She has an eye for design that I could never replicate. He gestured toward the living room with its carefully curated art pieces. That piece above the fireplace? She found that at a gallery in Brooklyn. Emerging artist. Nyla always sees potential before anyone else does. The lie came easily. Steve had hired an interior designer who'd done everything, but giving Nyla credit served multiple purposes. It made him look like a devoted husband. It explained her absence with implied importance, and it kept her present in the conversation without her actually being there to complicate things with her inconvenient humanity. She has wonderful taste, Diane said. I'd love to interview her sometime about the art collection, for the lifestyle section. She'd be honored, Steve replied. Once the baby comes and she's feeling more herself, I'll have her reach out to you. More guests drifted over, drawn by Steve's gravitational pull. He held court effortlessly, discussing market trends with the venture capitalists, complimenting spouses, remembering details about people's children and vacation homes. This was what he was born to do: orchestrate, influence, command attention without seeming to demand it. But every 10 minutes or so, someone would ask about Nyla. Should someone check on her? Asked Patricia Chun, Marcus's wife, with genuine concern. I had terrible vertigo with my second pregnancy. It can be scary. That's very kind, Steve said, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of appreciation. I checked on her just before coming back up. She's sleeping now, finally. The doctor prescribed rest above all else, and you know Nyla, she fights it. Always wants to be doing something, helping someone. I practically had to force her to lie down. Patricia smiled sympathetically. The strong ones are always the worst patients. Tell her I asked about her, and if she needs anything at all, she should call me. I know how isolating pregnancy can feel." "I will absolutely tell her that," Steve promised, knowing he would do no such thing. The last thing he needed was Patricia Chun trying to visit Nyla, asking uncomfortable questions, witnessing anything that didn't align with the narrative he was constructing. As Patricia walked away, Steve felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He pulled it out discreetly, a text from his assistant confirming that the contracts were being prepared in the study. Marcus Chun wanted to review them before the night ended. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Steve, my man." Marcus himself appeared, clapping Steve on the shoulder. The champagne incident might as well have never happened. Hell of a party. And I have to say, that proposal you sent over last week? Impressive. Really impressive. Steve's pulse quickened, but his expression remained calm. "I'm glad you think so. I believe we're positioned to dominate the market in ways no one else is anticipating." "That's exactly what we want to hear," Marcus said, lowering his voice slightly. "Listen, I don't want to talk business at a party. Your wife would kill me. But maybe we could step into your study for a few minutes? Iron out some details while they're fresh in my mind." "Absolutely," Steve said, already moving toward the hallway. "Though I should warn you, Nyla would absolutely not kill you. She'd kill me for not taking the meeting." He laughed, and Marcus laughed with him. Two men who understood that business always came first, wives and pregnancies an inconvenient human needs notwithstanding. As they walked, Steve caught a glimpse of himself in one of the hallway mirrors. He looked good, confident, successful, like a man who had everything under control. Like a man whose wife wasn't locked in a dog cage in the basement, potentially going into early labor from the stress and trauma of what he'd done to her. He pushed the thought away. Nyla was fine. She was resting, just like he'd told everyone. In a few hours, once the contracts were signed and the investors had left and his future was secured, he'd go down and release her. They'd have a difficult conversation, certainly. She'd be upset, maybe even furious. But she'd understand eventually. She had to understand. Everything he did for them, for their future, for the life they were building together. And if she didn't understand, well, that was a problem he'd deal with later. Right now, Marcus Chun was pulling out a pen, and the contracts were spread across Steve's mahogany desk, and the only thing that mattered was the signature that would change everything. Steve sat down across from Marcus, his smile never wavering, his hands steady as he pointed to various clauses and projections. "This is just the beginning," Steve said, and he believed it. This was his moment, his coronation. Nothing, not Nyla's dizzy spell, not her tears, not even the tiny voice in the back of his mind whispering that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Nothing would take this away from him. Upstairs, the party swirled on. The quartet played. The champagne flowed. People laughed and networked, and took photos for Instagram, capturing the glamour and success of Steve Williams's perfect evening. And in the basement, Nyla pressed her face against the cold steel bars and prayed that someone, anyone, would remember she existed. But Steve had ensured that no one would. He'd explained her away so perfectly, so compassionately, that her absence had become just another charming detail in the story of his success. The devoted husband with the pregnant wife who needed her rest. How considerate, how caring, how absolutely perfect. The lie was seamless, and that made it so much worse. Time moved differently in the cage. Nyla had no watch, no phone. Steve had taken her clutch when he'd pushed her inside, claiming he'd keep it safe. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a frequency that made her teeth ache, and the cold from the concrete floor had already seeped through her emerald gown and into her bones. She'd stopped screaming after the first 20 minutes. Her throat was raw, her voice reduced to a hoarse whisper, and the soundproofing was exactly as effective as Steve had promised. She could hear nothing from upstairs. No music, no laughter, no evidence that 60 people were directly above her head. And if she couldn't hear them, they certainly couldn't hear her. Nyla shifted position for the 100th time, trying to find some way to sit that didn't make her back scream in protest. The cage was large enough for a German shepherd to move around comfortably, but for a 6-month pregnant woman in an evening gown, it was a torture device. She couldn't stand fully. The top of the cage was too low. She couldn't stretch out. Her legs would only extend partially before hitting the bars. So she sat, knees drawn up as much as her belly would allow, one hand gripping the steel bars, the other resting protectively over her child. The baby had been active earlier, rolling and kicking in response to Nyla's elevated heart rate and the adrenaline flooding her system. But in the last 30 minutes, the movements had slowed. Nyla told herself it was normal, that the baby was just sleeping, but the fear gnawed at her. What if the stress was hurting the baby? What if something was wrong? That's when she felt the first real contraction. It started low in her abdomen, a tightening sensation that built slowly, like a fist clenching around her womb. Nyla's breath caught. This was different from the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been having for weeks. This was deeper, more insistent, radiating around to her lower back, where the pain already lived. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "No, no, no. Not yet. Please not yet." She breathed through it the way her birthing class had taught her. Slow inhale through the nose, long exhale through the mouth. The contraction peaked, held for what felt like an eternity, then gradually released. Nyla checked her mental clock. If another one came in less than 30 minutes, she'd know for certain. But maybe it was just stress. Maybe her body was reacting to the trauma, but not actually going into labor. She tried to focus on something else, anything else. The nursery they'd been preparing, with its soft grey walls and white furniture. The name they'd almost settled on, but kept changing their minds about. The life she'd imagined having with Steve before she'd really understood who he was. 15 minutes later, the second contraction hit. This one was stronger, unmistakable. Nyla's hands tightened around the bars as the pain rolled through her, and a sound escaped her throat, half gasp, half moan. When it passed, she was breathing hard, her forehead pressed against the cold steel. "Help!" she called out, even though she knew it was useless. "Somebody help me. Please." The soundproofed walls swallowed her voice like it was nothing. The contractions came with increasing regularity. 20 minutes apart, then 15, then 12. Each one stronger than the last. Each one bringing with it a wave of terror that crashed over Nyla and threatened to pull her under. She was going into labor, 6 weeks early, locked in a cage, in a soundproof room, while her husband smiled and shook hands and talked about market projections with men who would never know his wife was dying beneath their feet. Because she was dying. Nyla could feel it. Something was wrong. The contractions were too strong, too fast for early labor. And the baby had stopped moving entirely. "Steve!" she screamed, her ruined voice cracking. "Steve, something's wrong. The baby's not moving. Please." Nothing. Not even an echo. Nyla pulled herself up using the bars, trying to stand despite the low ceiling, thinking maybe if she could see something, reach something, find some way to signal for help. But her legs were weak, her body betraying her as another contraction seized her. She collapsed back onto the concrete, curling around her belly, sobbing. The pain was unlike anything she'd experienced. It wasn't just physical, though that was bad enough. It was the psychological torment of knowing she was completely helpless. Knowing that women died in childbirth every day, that complications happened, that being trapped in a cage with no medical care was essentially a death sentence for both her and her baby. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her unborn child, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I should have left him. I should have seen what he was. I should have protected you." Another contraction, this one so intense that Nyla screamed despite her raw throat. The sound bounced off the soundproof walls and died, just like she might die, just like her baby might die, all because she'd married a man who valued his career more than her life. Time blurred. The contractions came faster now, 8 minutes apart, then 6. Nyla lost track of how many she'd endured. She was drifting in and out of consciousness between them, exhaustion and pain and fear creating a fog she couldn't quite penetrate. At some point, she didn't know when, she felt wetness between her legs. Her water had broken, soaking through the emerald gown, pooling on the concrete floor. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of terror through her. This was really happening. Her body was going to deliver this baby, whether she was ready or not, whether there was a doctor present or not, whether she survived or not. "Please," Nyla begged the empty room, the soundproof walls, the God she'd stopped believing in years ago. "Please don't let my baby die. Take me if you have to, but please save my baby." Above her, separated by floors and soundproofing and her husband's monstrous ego, the party continued. The jazz quartet had transitioned to something more energetic. People were dancing now, their footsteps a rhythm Nyla couldn't hear, but could somehow feel through the building's bones. They were celebrating while she was dying. They were toasting Steve's success while his wife hemorrhaged on a basement floor. Another contraction, the worst yet. Nyla's vision went white at the edges. She couldn't do this. She wasn't strong enough. But her body didn't care about her strength or her fear or her desperate wishes. Her body was going to deliver this baby in a dog cage, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She thought about Steve finding her afterward. Would he even care? Would he feel remorse, or would he just be angry that she'd made a mess, that she'd created a problem he'd have to solve? Would he call 911 and play the devastated husband, or would he find some way to make this her fault too? The thought made her angry. A hot, bright anger that cut through the pain and the fear and the exhaustion. She wouldn't die. She refused to die and let Steve Williams walk away from this as some tragic widower. She would survive this, and she would make sure everyone knew what he'd done. She would scream his crimes from every rooftop, would testify in every court, would ensure that his perfect image shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. But first, she had to survive the next contraction. And the next. And the next. Nyla gripped the bars and breathed and prayed and raged. The baby she'd wanted so desperately was coming, whether the world was ready or not. And somehow, in that cold, soundproof room, with nothing but steel bars and concrete, and her own stubborn will to sustain her, Nyla Bishop decided she would live. She had to, because someone needed to tell this story. Someone needed to make sure that what Steve Williams had done in the name of success would haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. The contractions were 4 minutes apart now. And upstairs, Steve Williams was signing contracts that meant absolutely nothing compared to what was happening in his basement. Devin Martinez had built his reputation on understanding systems, how they worked, how they connected, how they could be optimized. As the founder of a smart home integration company that had just been acquired for $200 million, he saw technology everywhere, even at parties where he was supposed to relax and network. Which is why he noticed immediately that Steve Williams's sound system was inefficient. The jazz quartet was excellent, but their acoustic instruments were being drowned out by conversation in certain areas of the penthouse. Meanwhile, other corners were too quiet, creating dead zones where guests clustered awkwardly. Steve had clearly spent a fortune on the Bang & Olufsen speakers mounted throughout the space, but they weren't properly balanced or integrated. Devin's fingers itched to fix it. It was a professional compulsion, the same one that made him reorganize his mother's kitchen cabinets and optimize his friends' Wi-Fi networks without being asked. He pulled out his phone and opened the network scanner app he always kept handy. "What are you doing?" his girlfriend, Simone, asked, sipping her champagne. "You promised you'd actually socialize tonight." "I am socializing," Devin said absently, scrolling through the list of connected devices on Steve's network. "I'm just observing. The man spent at least $50,000 on this audio setup, and it's configured all wrong." "Devin, 2 minutes. I'm just going to see if I can access the control panel and make some adjustments. Trust me, everyone will have a better time if they can actually hear the music." Simone sighed but didn't stop him. She'd learned years ago that trying to separate Devin from a technical problem was like trying to separate a dog from a bone. The network was surprisingly open. Steve had clearly prioritized convenience over security, which tracked with his personality. Devin found the sound system controller within seconds and pulled up the interface on his phone. Just as he'd suspected, the zones were all wrong. The living room was set to 70% volume, while the terrace was at 40%. The hallways had no coverage at all. He started adjusting, sliding virtual controls with practiced ease. The music swelled slightly in the areas that needed it, creating a more balanced atmosphere. A few guests nearby looked up, noticing the difference without quite understanding why the party suddenly felt more cohesive. But as Devin navigated deeper into the system, he noticed something odd. There were more audio inputs than there should be. The jazz quartet's microphones, obviously. The ambient sound feeds from various rooms. But there was another source, listed simply as nursery cam basement. Devin frowned. Why would a nursery camera be in the basement? And why was it active when, according to the gossip he'd overheard, Nyla Williams was supposedly resting upstairs? Professional curiosity overrode his better judgment. He clicked on the audio feed. At first, there was nothing. Just the hollow sound of an empty room, maybe some ambient noise from the building's HVAC system. Devin was about to close out of it when he heard something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. A woman's scream, raw and desperate, cut short as if the person making it had run out of breath. "Jesus," Devin whispered, pulling his phone closer. "Simone, listen to this." But before he could hand her the phone, his finger accidentally swiped the wrong control. Instead of closing the audio feed, he'd activated the broadcast to all zones function. The sound system, designed to seamlessly integrate audio throughout the penthouse, did exactly what it was programmed to do. It broadcast the basement feed to every speaker in the house. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The jazz quartet's melody was suddenly underscored by a woman's agonized breathing, punctuated by a moan that could only be described as primal. The conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. 60 people stood frozen as the sound filled the penthouse. Undeniable, horrifying, impossible to ignore. "Help!" The woman's voice came through the speakers, broken and hoarse. "Somebody, please the baby." "What the hell is that?" someone near the terrace shouted. Devon's hands shook as he tried to mute the feed, but in his panic, he hit the wrong control again. Instead of muting, he'd amplified. The woman's screams grew louder, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, impossible to escape. "Steve!" Another voice in the recording, barely audible beneath the woman's cries. "Steve, please. I'm in labor. Something's wrong." Marcus Chen's wife, Patricia, went white. "That's Nyla," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Oh my God, that's Nyla's voice." The party erupted into chaos. People pulled out their phones, some trying to call 911, others recording everything. James Okonkwo was already moving toward the hallway, shouting Steve's name. Diane Richardson stood rooted to the spot, her journalist instincts capturing every detail, even as her face showed pure horror. And through it all, the audio continued. Another contraction, another scream. The sound of someone in the deepest kind of agony, the kind that meant life or death. "Where is she?" Patricia Chen demanded, grabbing the nearest staff member. "Where is Nyla?" Steve said she was upstairs resting. Devon finally managed to mute the feed, his face ashen. But the damage was done. Everyone had heard it. Everyone knew that somewhere in this penthouse, a pregnant woman was in active labor and calling for help. The feed said basement, Devon told Patricia, his voice shaking. "The camera is labeled nursery cam basement." Patricia didn't wait. She ran toward the hallway where she'd seen an elevator earlier, her heels clicking frantically against the marble. A dozen other guests followed her. Their evening was suddenly absurd against the backdrop of an emergency. The jazz quartet had stopped playing entirely. The remaining guests stood in shocked clusters, whispering frantically, trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Some were already leaving, uncomfortable with whatever nightmare was unfolding. Others moved closer, drawn by the same impulse that makes people slow down at car accidents. Steve Williams appeared from the study, Marcus Chen behind him, both men holding champagne flutes and looking pleased with themselves. The contracts were signed. The deal was done. Steve's smile was wide and genuine until he saw the crowd, until he registered the silence, until he heard someone say, "We heard Nyla screaming. She's in labor. In the basement." The champagne flute slipped from Steve's hand. It hit the marble floor and shattered, the sound like a gunshot in the terrible quiet. "What?" he said, but his voice had no conviction. His face had gone the color of ash. "Your wife," Patricia Chen's voice came from somewhere near the elevator, shrill with fury and fear. "Your pregnant wife is screaming for help in your basement. What the hell have you done?" Steve's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, an explanation, anything that could salvage this. But there was nothing. The audio Devon had accidentally broadcast had sealed his fate as surely as he'd sealed Nyla in that cage. Marcus Chen took a step back from Steve, his expression transforming from confusion to dawning horror to disgust in the space of seconds. "Tell me you didn't," he said quietly. "Tell me you didn't do what I think you did." But Steve couldn't tell him anything. Because he had. He'd locked his pregnant wife in a cage, so she wouldn't ruin his perfect evening. And now that evening had become his worst nightmare. From the elevator shaft, they could hear Patricia Chun screaming. "Someone call 911. Now! She's locked in a cage. Oh my God, she's locked in a cage and she's in labor." The remaining guests pulled out their phones. Dozens of them, all recording, all calling for help, all capturing the moment Steve Williams's carefully constructed empire collapsed around him. Devon stood frozen, his phone still clutched in his hand, the sound system interface still glowing on the screen. He'd only meant to fix the audio balance. He'd only wanted to make the party better. Instead, he'd exposed a monster. And as the sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer with every passing second, Devon realized that sometimes the most important thing technology could do wasn't optimize systems or create convenience. Sometimes it was simply bear witness to the truth, no matter how ugly that truth might be. The golden warmth of the ballroom suddenly felt sterile and thin as the first crackle of static cut through the smooth, expensive jazz. Steve Williams was in the middle of a self-congratulatory anecdote, his hand resting authoritatively on the shoulder of Julian Vane, the venture capitalist whose signature was worth $50 million. Steve's teeth were white. His suit was custom-tailored to hide the sweat of his ambition, and his eyes were already scanning the room for the next person he needed to impress. He was at the summit of his life. Then the music died. It didn't fade, it was severed. The sudden silence in a room full of 200 people was deafening, a physical weight that made every guest turn toward the ceiling-mounted speakers. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of air conditioning and the distant clink of a server's tray. Then, a sharp, digital chirp echoed through the hall, the sound of a smart home system syncing to a new input. "Testing, testing. The nursery link is active," a voice whispered from the speakers. It was the house manager's voice, recorded hours ago during a routine system check, but it was immediately followed by a much more familiar, much more chilling sound. The ballroom was filled with the sound of a heavy metal latch sliding home. Clack-shink. The guests froze. Steve's smile didn't vanish, it curdled. He recognized that sound. It was the sound of the reinforced kennel door in the soundproof basement suite, a room he had designed specifically to keep the world out. But now, the house was inviting the world in. "Steve? Steve, please, I can't breathe well in here. The air is too tight." It was Nyla. Her voice was unmistakable, rich and melodic normally, but now it was frayed, thin with a terror that made the hair on the back of the guests' necks stand up. The audio was crystal clear, piped through $40,000 worth of high-fidelity speakers. Steve felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He reached into his pocket for his phone, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. He needed to kill the feed. He needed to shut her up. But the screen was frozen in a software update loop, a freak digital accident that was stripping away his mask in real time. "Shut up, Nyla," Steve's voice boomed through the ballroom. It wasn't the voice of the charming executive the guests knew. This voice was a jagged blade, dripping with a cold, sociopathic disdain. "You're making a scene. You've been making a scene since the first trimester. You're a distraction. You're messy. Look at you, spilling drinks and gasping for air like a common theatre actress. "You're staying right there." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Julian Vane stepped back from Steve, his expression shifting from professional respect to visceral disgust. "Steve, I think the baby is coming." Nyla's voice rose, punctuated by a sharp, guttural moan of pain that echoed off the marble floors. The sound of her palms hitting the steel bars of the cage was rhythmic and desperate. "Please, Steve. It's early. Something is wrong. Just let me out. I'll go to the bedroom. I won't let anyone see me. I promise. Just don't leave me in this cage." The word cage hit the room like a physical blow. The elegant women in their silk gowns clutched their pearls, and the men stood paralyzed. The contrast was a nightmare. The smell of expensive perfume and Wagyu beef upstairs, while the speakers broadcast the sounds of a pregnant woman trapped like an animal in the dark below. Steve scrambled toward the sound system's control panel, hidden behind a velvet curtain, but his path was blocked by his own head of security, a man who had looked up to Steve until this very second. The guard didn't move. He simply looked at Steve with a profound, silent loathing. "You stay in the cage until the last guest is gone," Steve's recorded voice continued, cold and final. "You want to act like a liability? I'll treat you like one. If you make a sound, if you ruin this deal, I will make sure you never see the light of day again. Do you understand me? You're a trophy, Nyla, and trophies stay where they are put." The recording ended with the sound of a heavy door slamming shut, followed by the muffled, heartbreaking sound of Nyla sobbing, her cries turning into the rhythmic, panting breaths of a woman in the throes of forced labor. The silence that followed was worse than the audio. It was the silence of a vacuum. Steve stood in the center of the ballroom, the most powerful man in the room, now reduced to a monster in a tuxedo. He looked at Julian Vane, his mouth opening to offer an explanation, a lie, a pivot, anything to save the deal. It's a misunderstanding," Steve stammered, his voice high and cracking. She's been having delusions. It's a medical precaution. A joke, really. We were role-playing." "A joke?" Julian Vane interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He looked around at the other investors, then back at Steve. "I've seen enough of your vision, Williams. You aren't a leader. You're a predator." Before Steve could respond, the sound of Nyla's pain spiked. A high, piercing scream that tore through the speakers, the sound of a woman who had reached the end of her endurance. "The basement," someone shouted. "Get to the basement." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic stampede. The facade of the perfect party was gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic rush to save a life. Steve tried to push through the crowd to stop them, to regain control of his house, but he was no longer the master of this domain. He was tripped, shoved, and ignored. As the guests poured toward the basement stairs, the smart home system flared to life one last time. The screen on the wall, which had been displaying the company's stock projections, flickered and died. In its place, the nursery monitor's night vision camera finally synced. The entire ballroom stopped and looked at the screen. There, in grainy black and white, was Nyla Bishop, 30 years old, brilliant, pregnant, and broken, curled in a ball inside a steel dog kennel, her hand reaching through the bars toward a world that had finally, mercifully, heard her cry. Steve Williams stood alone in the center of the room as the sirens began to wail in the distance. The unmasking was complete. He had wanted the world to see his power, but all they saw was his soul, and it was smaller than the cage he had built for his wife. The heavy oak door to the basement didn't just open. It groaned under the collective weight of a dozen frantic men and women who had traded their champagne flutes for hammers and heavy decorative vases. At the head of the surge was Julian Vane, and the head of security, Marcus, whose professional stoicism had shattered the moment he heard Nyla's cry. Steve scrambled after them, his face a distorted mask of panic and fading authority, screaming about private property and legal injunctions, but his words were drowned out by the thunder of feet on the wooden stairs. The basement was a cathedral of cold concrete and fluorescent humming, a jarring contrast to the velvet-draped opulence above. At the far end of the room, tucked behind a row of industrial storage shelves, sat the cage. It was a cold, reinforced steel structure designed for a large guard dog, but as the crowd rounded the corner, the sight that greeted them was far more harrowing. Nyla was slumped against the bars, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold metal. Her silk maternity gown, once a symbol of elegance, was damp with sweat and stained with the fluids of a body in crisis. "Get her out! Get the keys!" a woman screamed, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and maternal instinct. Steve pushed through the back of the crowd, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "It's coded. Only I have the—" He stopped mid-sentence as he realized he had just admitted to the orchestration of the crime. For a split second, he tried to turn back toward the stairs, a primal urge to flee taking hold, but Marcus was faster. With a roar of betrayed loyalty, the massive security guard tackled Steve into a stack of empty crates. The sound of Steve hitting the floor was hollow and final, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp wheeze as Marcus pinned him down, his knee pressed firmly into the small of the tech mogul's back. "The code, Steve. Give me the damn code." Marcus barked, his voice vibrating with a rage that silenced Steve's pathetic whimpers. Steve mumbled the 4 digits, the date of his first $1 million merger. It was the ultimate testament to his ego. Even his wife's prison was a monument to his net worth. As the electronic lock chirped and the heavy door swung open, Julian Vane and a guest who was a retired trauma surgeon rushed to Nyla's side. She didn't cry out when they touched her. She was past the point of screaming. Her breath came in shallow, ragged hitches, and her eyes were unfocused, glassy with the onset of shock. The surgeon placed a hand on her abdomen, his face hardening as he felt the unnatural tension of her muscles. "She's in active, obstructed labor," the doctor announced, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't have time for an ambulance to navigate the driveway traffic. Someone get a medical kit from the cars and clear the hallway." The rescue was a blur of frantic, coordinated motion. They lifted Nyla onto a thick duvet brought down from the guest rooms, her body trembling violently. The high society guests, people who usually spent their evenings discussing offshore accounts and modern art, were now forming a human chain to carry her out of the shadows. They moved with a singular purpose, their expensive jewelry catching the harsh basement light as they worked to undo the cruelty of the man they had once toasted. As they carried Nyla past Steve, who was being zip-tied by another security staff member, her eyes momentarily locked with his. There was no anger in her gaze, only a profound, chilling emptiness. It was the look of a woman who had already mourned the man he used to be, and was now simply looking at a stranger. Steve tried to speak, perhaps to offer one last excuse or a plea for his reputation, but the words died in his throat as the crowd surged past him, leaving him alone in the basement he had built to hide his sins. Upstairs, the blue and red lights of the first police cruisers began to pulse against the mansion's windows, turning the white marble exterior into a strobe of impending judgment. Nyla was transitioned to the floor of the foyer, surrounded by people who were no longer guests, but witnesses. As the paramedics burst through the front door, Nyla took a ragged breath and reached out, her hand finding Julian Vane's sleeve. "Save! Save the baby," she whispered, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "We have you, Nyla," Julian replied, his voice thick with emotion as he looked up at the officers entering the house. "The world heard you. You're never going back in that cage." As the stretcher was wheeled out into the cool night air, the transition was complete. The party was dead, the deal was incinerated, and the man who thought he could cage the truth was being led out in shadows, finally realizing that the only person he had truly imprisoned was himself. The walls of the county jail were a flat, lifeless grey that seemed to absorb light, a far cry from the Venetian plaster of the Williams estate. Steve sat on the edge of a thin, communal cot, his custom-tailored shirt replaced by an oversized orange jumpsuit that made his once commanding frame look brittle and small. Above him, mounted in a corner protected by heavy plexiglass, a television flickered with the morning news. The volume was low, but the image was sharp enough to pierce the silence of his cell. There was Nyla. She wasn't the trembling woman he had tried to break in the dark of a basement. She stood on a sun-drenched stage, the skyline of the city shimmering behind her. Her hair was natural and full, her face radiant with a peace that Steve realized he had never truly allowed her to have. In her arms, she held a toddler with Steve's eyes, but Nyla's gentle spirit. A son who would grow up knowing his father only as a cautionary tale printed in law textbooks and tabloid archives. The news anchor's voice drifted through the bars, speaking of the Bishop Foundation, a multi-million-dollar venture Nyla had built from the ashes of her trauma. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a titan of industry, using the very settlement that had stripped Steve of his fortune to build a network of safe havens and legal resources for women trapped in the gilded cages of domestic control. She had taken his obsession with legacy and turned it into something built on healing rather than domination. Steve watched as the camera zoomed in on her. She was speaking about resilience, about the moment she realized that the bars of a cage couldn't hold a spirit that had already decided to be free. There was no mention of his name. To the world, and to her, he had become a ghost, a footnote in a much more important story. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the cold concrete of the cell wall, instinctively looking for a remote to change the channel, to exert some form of control over the narrative. But there was no remote. There were no servants, no investors to charm, and no wife to silence. On the screen, Nyla laughed as her son reached up to grab the microphone. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, a sound that had never existed in the house Steve had built. He realized then that his greatest failure wasn't the loss of his company or his social standing. It was the fact that Nyla was more powerful in her vulnerability than he had ever been in his arrogance. The segment ended with a shot of Nyla walking off stage, surrounded by a team of women who looked at her with genuine respect, not the fearful sycophancy Steve had demanded from his peers. As the news transitioned to a weather report, the screen reflected Steve's own face in the plexiglass, haggard, graying, and utterly alone. He sat back in the shadows of the cell, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where the music and the applause used to be. For years, he had told Nyla that she was nothing without him, that the world only cared about her because of the shadow he cast. But as he stared at the blank grey wall, the truth finally settled into his bones with the weight of a life sentence. The cage had never been for her. He had been building it for himself, brick by brick, lie by lie, until the door had finally slammed shut. Nyla Bishop was free, thriving in a world of light, while Steve Williams remained exactly where his choices had led him. Trapped in the dark, forgotten by the legacy he had died to protect. Dear viewers, so, what do you think? Did Nyla and her baby get the justice they deserved? Could you have stood up in that ballroom and turned your back on a man as powerful as Steve Williams? Or would the fear of his influence have kept you silent? What truly makes a man successful? Is it the height of his skyscraper, or the way he treats those behind closed doors? Drop a comment and let me know. And tell me, have you ever had to be a Marcus? The one who breaks the code of silence, who risks their career to do what is right when the person in charge has lost their soul? Or have you been a Nyla, trapped in a cage of someone else's making, waiting for the world to finally hear your voice? We all need people who listen to the silence, who look past the glittering chandeliers to see the shadows underneath, and who aren't afraid to break down the doors that are meant to keep the truth buried. If you were moved by this story about a woman who survived the unthinkable to build a legacy of her own, about a high society monster who learned that control is just an illusion, and about the moment a smart home's glitch became a victim's lifeline, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I post new high-stakes stories of reckoning and redemption every day, and you don't want to miss the next time the truth comes to light. Like this video if you want more stories about the strength of mothers, about the downfall of those who abuse their power, and about the unbreakable bond between a woman and her child. Your likes tell me you want more tales of justice, unflinching, powerful, and poetic justice. This is Blissful Stories, where the most expensive mansions can hide the darkest secrets, where a mother's scream is louder than any jazz quartet, and where true power is found in the courage to walk away from a golden cage. Until tomorrow, remember, perfection is a mask, but resilience is a crown. Sometimes the only way to find your strength is to survive the dark and walk toward the light.